Friends, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for this program sponsored by Community Church of Boston. Community Church of Boston is a free community united for the study and practice of universal values, seeking to apply ethical ideas to individual life and cooperative principles to economic life. So friends, again, welcome. In these events, I often like to mention that Community Church has existed for over 100 years. And in the last 100 years, we've had many speakers. One of the speakers was W.E.B. Du Bois. And we have a video of his, an audio recording of his speaking to Community Church in 1959, titled Life in Soviet Union, Life in China, after he returned from a visit from China and Soviet Union in 1959. So I think one of the really valuable services of community church is we try to provide perspectives that we may not hear from the mainstream US media or corporate media. And I think that's what we're doing tonight or today. So again, friends, thank you so much for joining us. Our guest speaker today is Seyed Mohammad Marandi. You may have seen him on very well-known, very popular podcasts and channels and outlets. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from him about Iran, which is a topic that we have. There's a lot of propaganda about in the U.S. So I'm very grateful to hear a different perspective today. Seyed Mohammad Marandi is a professor of English literature and Orientalism in the University of Tehran. For the format of today's event, he'll open with some opening remarks, and then for the remainder of the hour, we'll have a question and answer portion. So it is my honor to welcome and to introduce Professor Marandi. Professor, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a great honor to be speaking with your friends and colleagues at the Community Church of Boston.
Thank you. So do you want to begin with your opening remarks?
Your voice went mute.
I just said, would you like to get started with your opening remarks?
I can't hear your voice.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Great. I was just saying, Professor, do you want to begin with your opening remarks for us?
Sure. Thank you very much. Again, I'm very grateful for being here and having the opportunity to speak to our friends and colleagues and comrades and sisters and brothers. The introduction, actually, I think, is something that we should be thinking about, in the sense that talking about a visit, having the audio recording of a speaker speaking about his visit to the Soviet Union and China, sort of fits in with the discussion that we are having today, in that Iran, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a country that is not understood well at all in the United States. In fact, because of the sheer power of Western media, American media in particular, it is not well understood anywhere in the world, I think, except for some areas which have a close relationship with the country and where people see through the propaganda. In fact, over the years, as I've been working with media and with academics to try to create a different environment for understanding Iran, I met two very good and decent friends, Flint Leverett and Hillary Mann Leverett, husband and wife, who worked in the White House. And Flint resigned over the Iraq War in 2003. And we um, began to have a friendship, and we met one another, and they visited Iran 3 times, and ultimately they wrote a book on Iran called Going to Tehran. And because of the different view of Iran that they held, or the view that they held a after years of coming and going, uh, they were sidelined and they were marginalized. So as their views about Iran evolved, they became more marginalized within the American political establishment. And ultimately, they were expelled in a sense. And even though they had worked in a very high ranking government officials, um, they are ignored simply because their views on Iran evolved. And actually, I would advise people to read their book, Going to Tehran, even though it was written about a decade ago. And I don't necessarily agree with everything in the book, but I think it's a very good book to read. But the point is that visiting, I'm sure, the Soviet Union back then, and or visiting China back then came at a price. And nowadays, I think visiting Russia and China may also have a price. You may also have to pay a price as well. But I think visiting Iran is something that we should be seeing more often by friends and colleagues and people who are interested in politics so that they could see through the propaganda and to understand the world in a different way. The problem, I think, that the United States has more than anything else is that it defines the world. It tries to impose that definition, or it tries to have the rest of the world accept that definition. And then it carries out policies against different countries or towards different countries based on those definitions, based on those narratives, based on often propaganda. So they believe their own propaganda and they fail in their policies. I would assume we could say that's the case in Latin America or across Africa. But without a doubt, when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran, when it comes to West Asia, uh, this has led to many failures in the United States. Uh, but the problem, of course, in the United States is there is no accountability. The people who carry out failed policies, they are not punished. They are not marginalized. They are not ignored. They continue to be the go-to people for future uh, policy decisions. They're the people who the politicians in the United States and the political leaders or the military leaders speak to when they want to think about uh, pursuing a course of action in our part of the world. And I think the same is true with Russia and China in particular. So since there's no accountability, we see no change. And the same narratives are repeated over and over again for decades. And the people who produce those narratives are well paid. They teach at good universities. They work in think tanks and receive very good salaries. And they hire so-called Iranians who repeat what needs to be said. In other words, they repeat the narrative, the accepted narrative in Washington. And if anyone says anything that goes counter to those narratives, well, then they are a mouthpiece of a dying regime. They are a mouthpiece of a dictatorship, a corrupt dictatorship, a dictatorship that's falling apart, that's incapable of governing itself, that is brutal towards women, that hates freedom, and so on. But the problem, of course, with these narratives is that since they're based on a great deal of Orientalism, on an Orientalist tradition, and there's a great deal of anger and hostility mixed with this. These narratives have a large degree of contradictions within them, but they go unnoticed. The same evil and ugly regime that is hated and despised by its own people is also a growing threat, is also a threat to the region, if not the world, which would seem to be paradoxical. It seem to be impossible to be both corrupt and collapsing, but also a rising threat simultaneously. But when it comes to Iran, you can have they can have their cake and they can eat it too. I think the best way to understand the Islamic Republic of Iran is first to recognize that Iran is a normal country, like other countries across the world. When you enter the country, you will see people walking down the streets, people driving in their cars, going to work, going home, going shopping, visiting people, just like anywhere else. In Iran, you'll see women taxi drivers, you'll see women scientists. At university, you'll see women professors being hired in large numbers. You'll see that the majority of students are women. You'll see women in high-ranking positions, but also you'll see women working in factories. You'll see women pilots, but you'll also see women housewives. It is a country that is not different from the countries that the United States usually glorifies or supports or has been supporting traditionally. In fact, I would argue that in order to counter Iran, in order to weaken Iran, the United States and its allies have created an Islam, an American Islam, which is despotic. They have empowered a type of Islam that is brutal, such as ISIS, such as Al Qaeda, such as many of the extremist movements that we've seen in Afghanistan or Libya, and such as the governments in the Persian Gulf that have been funding these extremist groups, such as in Qatar, in particular over the last couple of decades, but Saudi Arabia has been doing so as well for decades. The Saudis, ironically, under Mohammed bin Salman, have been distancing themselves from many of these movements, while Qatar, which is a close ally of the United States and where CENTCOM is based, is funding them. And today we see that the head of the Al Qaeda in Syria was meeting the ruler of Qatar in Damascus. So, in order to counter the revolution and also the Soviet Union, the United States began funding extremism. We saw that in Afghanistan when Brzezinski and Carter funded Afghan jihadists or Mujahideen, as they called it, in order to encourage the Soviet Union to invade the country. They didn't begin it after the invasion. They did this before the invasion. They wanted to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union. In other words, they were sacrificing a country because of their own geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union. And then after that, they used the same tools of extremism, Wahhabism and Salafism and Takfiri ideology against Iran. So the same people who prevent women from going to school, the same people who behead innocent civilians in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, these same people were supported by the United States, its European allies, the Israeli regime, of course, NATO, and of course their regional partners, whether it's in Ankara or in the Persian Gulf or in Amman, Jordan. So the same groups that carry out these atrocities are allies of the United States, yet the United States attributes this sort of behavior to Iran. And that, I think, is something that is a major challenge for the Islamic Republic of Iran and its friends and allies across the world, because Iran does not have much of a voice. It does not have a media. Of course, Iran has media, but it's all been sanctioned. So people in the West cannot watch or use Iranian media or access Iranian media easily because of the sanctions. And therefore, it continues to be a challenge for Iranians to get through and to reach a broader audience. But I do think something has changed, and that is Gaza. The genocide in Gaza has changed the views of many people across the world. Because whatever you may think about the Islamic Republic of Iran, it has been the only country that was defending the people of Gaza by supporting the resistance, continuing to support the resistance. How they do it, God knows. The resistance in Gaza, the resistance in the West Bank, and of course, supporting the axis of resistance, despite experiencing suffering through maximum pressure sanctions. It continues to aid and assist a resistance from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, which has been fighting to put an end to the genocide. So we had the Islamic Republic of Iran and the so-called, or the axis of resistance on the one side, and we had Western powers and their regional partners on the other side. Even countries like Turkey, the government was assisting the Israeli regime throughout the genocide by sending it oil, cheap oil from Baku. The Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt all were doing business with the regime. So while the West, the collective West, was supporting the Israeli regime, and regional countries were assisting the regime, and countries across the world were at most indifferent, the Islamic Republic of Iran was paying a price to fight against the genocide and to support the Palestinian people. And that has created a change across the world, a change that I have noticed. As the months went on, more people began to wonder whether Iran is really all that evil and bad if it is the only country that is paying a price to support the axis of resistance. When I say the only country, of course, Yemen, the government of Yemen, is just as significant, and it is paying just a heavy price, if not a much heavier price, than the Islamic Republic of Iran. But unfortunately, the government of Yemen is not considered to be the government of the country by the so-called international community, and that is for political reasons. It is because the government in Yemen is not a government that has been acceptable to Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and other family regimes in the region, and therefore the West and others in the UN Security Council have made sure that the government of Yemen is not internationally recognized. But in any case, the axis of resistance has continued to support the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause. And that has created I can say with confidence, a sea change. It hasn't turned things around completely, but it has raised questions among many people with regards to the narratives of Iran and the narratives around Iran and the resistance. I think it's best for me to stop here because the questions that are colleagues and comrades and brothers and sisters raise, I think would be more interesting than anything that I could say by continuing this talk.
Thank you very much, Professor, for those eloquent and important remarks. And we look forward to the Q&A. I'll just ask people if they could please put their questions in the chat. That would be very helpful. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. I also want to take a moment very quickly to acknowledge and to remember Joan Livingston, a very important member of Community Church of Boston who passed away recently. So we're just remembering her. She would have been here right now if she was alive. This is a big loss for Community Church. So I just wanted to acknowledge Joan Livingston. Professor Marandi, why is the U.S. policy so hostile towards Iran? To what extent, if any, is it because of Israel?
Yes, I think Israel is definitely a big part of it. Before the revolution took place, the revolutionaries in Iran were very critical of the Shah and the regime because it was a despotic regime. It was completely reliant on the United States, and key decisions were made in Washington and back then in London when the British government was more influential. So the issue of sovereignty was important. The issue of indigenous values were important, indigenous values that were being ignored since the Shah was he and his people were basically worshipped Western culture and Western ideology, and he looked down at indigenous culture and values in the country. That was another issue. But also, the Shah of Iran, while he had a notorious secret police called the Savak, which the Americans created, the CIA helped build the Savak. The Shah of Iran also supported U.S. policy in South Africa and with regards to the Israeli regime. The revolutionaries were fully opposed to both apartheid in Palestine and in South Africa. These were two key foreign policy issues of the revolutionaries and, of course, Ayatollah Khomeini. So when the revolution happened, obviously the Israeli embassy, or what was the equivalent to the Israeli embassy, was immediately shut down. And it was handed over to the Palestinians, the building, and that square, which the building is very close to, it was renamed Palestine Square, and it is today still Palestine Square. Iran also immediately broke off ties with apartheid South Africa, and it began to support the resistance both in Palestine and in South Africa, in particular the ANC and the military wing of the ANC. So that obviously made the Israeli regime very angry, the Israeli lobby very hostile, but also the issue was how Iran split from the United States. Iran literally belonged to the United States. And after the revolution, the United States immediately tried to take it back. And it used the embassy for espionage, to support terrorist organizations, and to destabilize the revolution. And that, of course, led to the embassy takeover. And the embassy takeover was a humiliation for the US political establishment. And to be very blunt, the United States has never forgiven Iran for the revolution itself, for the humiliation of the embassy takeover, even though the embassy takeover was in response to U.S. policy. It was a response to the fact that the United States had just given refuge to the Shah, who had killed many thousands of Iranians on the streets during the month of revolution, and many, many thousands during the years of rule and brutal rule that he had in the country beforehand. So the US gave refuge to the Shah. The Iranians were fearful that the United States would repeat the 1953 coup, where the national government was overthrown and the Shah was installed by the United States and the UK. So the reasons for the embassy takeover were based upon history and based upon the activities of the United States after the revolution. But still, it was the United States, the elites in the United States have been hostile ever since. So I think it's both a combination of the Israeli regime and its lobby and its influence in the United States, but also the anger that the elites, even though many of them are no longer alive, but that anger still remains among many American senators who were back then were either children or not even born, and other elites in the United States.
There's a question in the chat where they're asking, audience member is asking, what kind of sanctions are against Iran by the US? How does this impact the Iranian people? And also, Professor, I'll add to that, these US policies of sanctioning Iran, sanctioning Russia, aren't they just incentivizing countries like Iran and Russia to actually work closer together and become more self-sufficient, independent of the West? Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. The Iranians and the Russians have grown closer to one another, partially because of the sanctions. The US policy has acted as a catalyst to strengthen ties and to strengthen ties with China because the China is increasingly becoming sanctioned, and the Chinese are also fearful that the United States will try to isolate it by sanctioning countries that have good relations with China. So the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, and other countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, uh, they are increasingly working together to find ways to do trade, business and trade without depending on Western financial institutions. And one reason why BRICS has become so important, and we saw how Trump has angrily spoken about uh, BRICS literally hours ago, is because of US policy, is because they want alternatives so that they are not held hostage to the US dollar or financial institutions. But what Trump gets wrong is that BRICS is not trying to establish a currency. They are trying to create mechanisms where, for example, the countries can use their own currencies to do trade, and that's nothing that he can do anything about. The sanctions on Iran are very extensive. They cover everything. They are called maximum pressure sanctions. Literally everything is sanctioned. The Iranians have been blocked from the international financial system. So I cannot use the international financial system to send a single cent to you. And you cannot send a single cent to me through the international financial system. So imagine how that makes trade more difficult. But it's not just that. Goods are sanctioned, trade is sanctioned, investment is sanctioned, everything is sanctioned. Now, the Iranian economy continues to function, but these have caused many difficulties. Pharmaceutical companies that sell uh, Iranians medicine, they will not send them because they're fearful of the sanctions. Iranian pharmaceutical companies that purchase raw materials from abroad, they cannot bring in that material because the ships are sanctioned, because they're sanctioned they're prohibited from using the banking sector, and because the companies are sanctioned, and those companies that deal with Iranian pharmaceutical countries are fearful of being sanctioned. So it's sanctions everywhere, and it's like a minefield. Of course, companies in Iran, business in Iran have adjusted, and they've decreased their dependence on Western economies and do more business with the global South. And they find ways and means to do business by circumventing these sanctions, but it still makes life more difficult, and people do die as a result. But now that you see the United States using sanctions against more countries, including Russia, as mentioned before, it has become easier for Iran. The oil sector is sanctioned. The gas sector is sanctioned. And that, of course, hurts the Iranian economy. It hurts the global economy because it raises the price of fuel. But in any case, the United States governments have all pursued a similar policy. Actually, the maximum pressure sanctions were first introduced by Obama. And Trump's criticism of Obama was that after the nuclear deal, he decreased some of those sanctions, even though Obama never uh, he never fulfilled his obligations within the framework of the nuclear deal with Iran, and he cheated Iran, whereas the Iranians fully implemented the deal. But in any case, Trump was critical of Obama. So it's not that Trump actually initiated these sanctions, it was Obama. Trump reinforced them, and under Biden, uh, the policy continued.
Can you describe for us in more detail the recent treaty of cooperation between Iran and Russia and its significance and implications?
Well, the Iranians and the Russians have been moving closer to each other. As I mentioned before, the United States has acted as a catalyst. Both countries have much in common. They're sanctioned by the West, and therefore they have no fear of for trading with one another. Since they're both sanctioned, it doesn't make a difference. Uh, they are both major oil producers. Russia has the largest known gas reserves in the world, and Iran is second to Russia. So they have a lot of common interests when it comes to uh, energy and the production of energy and investment in energy and pipelines. Also, there is the north-south corridor that is now being developed, which will connect Russia to the Persian Gulf through Iran, both through the Caspian Sea to the west of the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan, the Republic of Azerbaijan, and to the east of the Caspian Sea. And that would go through Turkmenistan, which is also which has also huge reserves in natural gas. So Russia, through Iran, will be able to trade with Africa. It will be able to do business and trade with the Indian subcontinent and East Asia as well as Southeast Asia. And although the North-South corridor was something that the two countries agreed to develop together decades ago, they neglected that. And both countries actually continued to focus on Europe and the United States. But after they were both sanctioned, especially over the last 3 years, the two countries became much more serious about the corridor, and now they've recognized that the corridor is much more important than they thought. And in future, it will be a major trading route, and it would also links Iran to uh, East Europe, and of course, the whole of Russia, being the largest country in the world with huge resources, that will have enormous benefits for Iran. Iran will become a hub for Russian energy, but also for Russian grains and wheat. And also, in addition to that, the two countries, they're coordinating their foreign policy on certain issues more closely with one another. And as we've all heard in the media, the military cooperation between the two countries has increased significantly. Western governments claim that Iranian drones and missiles are used by Russia, and that Russia is also involved in with Iranian providing Iran with fighter jets. So the cooperation between the two countries has expanded very rapidly, especially over the last 3 years. And I think that this signing ceremony symbolizes an intent by the two governments to push this even further.
I'm going to read a question that's in the chat from our friend Faisal, who's actually joining us from Sri Lanka. Faisal writes, Professor Marandi, are you aware of the quote new map of West Asia drawn by Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, which highlighted the establishment of a Greater Israel on the basis that Anglo-French partitioning of West Asia is out of date and of no relevance today, and which propagated Brzezinski's plan to break up West Asia into smaller Waziristans?
I don't know about this particular map, but that has always been the objective. The Israeli regime and its Western backers have always tried to make sure that West Asia and North Africa is weak, that it is fragmented, that it is broken, so that the Israeli regime could have uh, full authority over that area. And of course, we see today that Egypt is a diminished power compared to what it was 5, 6 decades ago. Syria is now broken. Al Qaeda, Al Qaeda, the same people who we were told carried out 9/11, the same people who we were told carried out the bombings in London on 7/7, as they called it back then, the same people who carried out the Manchester Arena bombing, the same people are now in power in Damascus. And this is not by coincidence. We all know that Jake Sullivan, in a famous email, well, it is now a famous email, to Hillary Clinton, said that on February the 12th, 2012, that Al Qaeda is on our side in Syria. And the reason is that the United States wanted to initiate a dirty war and to destroy and fragment Syria for the sake of Israel. And of course, Mr. Erdogan went along with this to get his piece of the cake. Lebanon is, of course, always has always been divided. The Western embassies in Lebanon have always been conspiring against the resistance, and therefore, it is, I think, the months and years ahead will be continue to be a major challenge for the region. Jordan has a very unpopular regime that is only in power because the United States supports it extensively, and the Israeli regime supports it extensively. However, I do believe that the world is changing. And with the decline of the US empire, and with the rise of alternative powers, and with the rise of the axis of resistance, the Israeli regime has suffered many serious blows over the past 15, 16 months. It's not just that they failed militarily in Lebanon to gain any foothold. It's not just that they failed in Gaza to vanquish the resistance. It's not that their economy has been in deep trouble for the last year. All that is true, but I think the Israeli regime has, in the eyes of the global majority, it has lost its legitimacy. People across the world have seen the regime as brutal, barbaric, ruthless, genocidal, and illegitimate, morally illegitimate. People who in the past knew nothing about Palestine and about what was going on in Palestine began to ask questions after they would see daily scenes of the slaughter of children and innocent women. Increasingly, people ask questions. It's not by coincidence that even among Trump's supporters today, you see people like Candace Owens changing her views, or Tucker Carlson bringing people to speak about Israel who have very different views than what we would hear before. This is, of course, a sea change. I'm not saying that the Israeli regime is going to collapse tomorrow or next month or next year, but these are new circumstances. We are living in a very different world from the past. And I think that the Zionist project simply cannot last. And the axis of resistance will continue to support the Palestinian people until that goal is achieved, until Palestine is free and the land where Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live as equals. Some will say and many have, that the fall of Syria was a major blow to the Axis of Resistance. I would agree that it was a tactical defeat, but in the long term, I think actually it's going to be the opposite. Because what the United States, Erdogan, and Netanyahu have done is that they have created a dangerous environment for the US camp in West Asia. The countries that are most vulnerable to extremism, the extremism that now the extremism that the groups in Syria uh, pursue, uh, are regimes in the American camp. Saudi Arabia is vulnerable. Egypt is vulnerable. Turkey is vulnerable. Uh, Countries across the Arabian Peninsula are vulnerable to these groups. And in addition to that, Syria is broken. The burden of Syria is no longer on the shoulders of Iran. Iran spent significant sums of money to help the people of Syria. Free oil and other uh, aid was flowing into Syria through Iran, despite the maximum pressure sanctions. Now that is something that Turkey and Qatar have to think about, especially now that the bureaucracy is destroyed and that the Israeli regime has destroyed much of the infrastructure over the past few weeks. This is going to be a very heavy burden. The Russians are no longer providing assistance. So Mr. Erdogan, who did not think that his militias would be able to take Damascus, the plan was to go to Aleppo, and not. I don't even think they believed that they would capture Aleppo itself. They wanted to get near Aleppo. But the Syrian regime collapsed. And so they went all the way to Damascus. Now, for Iran, it was never as if Syria was uh, had a wonderful regime. The government was a Ba'athist government, like the government of Saddam Hussein, which was was a part of the Ba'athist party too. These were two factions in Syria and Iraq in the past, in the 1980s, that had Ba'athist and 1990s that had Ba'athist party rule. But these two factions were hostile towards one another. Syria was friendly to Iran. Saddam Hussein, of course, was an enemy of Iran, supported by the West in his animosity until they turned against him after Kuwait. So it wasn't as if that the Iranians loved the Syrian government, but the Iranians believed that the Syrian government was more independent than other Arab regimes. And also, the Iranians believed and continue to believe that the Syrian government, for all its flaws, was infinitely better than Al Qaeda, uh, the Al Qaeda forces that NATO and regional regimes were supporting and continue to support. Assad, in other words, was infinitely better than Jolani or Abu Bakr Baghdadi, ISIS, Al Qaeda, and the other groups.
What are your thoughts about the ceasefire in Gaza and the prisoner exchange?
I think it's a huge victory, and Hamas and its allies, uh, they have achieved a magnificent victory. However, it's very unclear what's going to happen next. Trump has made outrageous an outrageous statements about expelling the Gazans, the Palestinians from Gaza. I find that I find that impossible to imagine after 15, 16 months of genocide and Holocaust, where the Palestinians refused to move, that Trump would be able to force them out. But it is unclear if the ceasefire will hold. It is unclear that Netanyahu, who is struggling for his own political survival and who needs the more extremist elements of 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 the Israeli political life in his coalition to preserve power, yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult for him to um, continue the ceasefire. His coalition, members of his coalition, want the genocide to begin again. So it's unclear what's going to happen. We may have a continuation of what we've had over the past 15, 16 months. However, this is still a major victory and a major humiliation for the regime and a major show of power by not just the resistance, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the others, but by ordinary Palestinians who refuse to budge. And the same is true in Lebanon. We saw on the same day that Palestinians were moving to the north and retaking there and going back home, we saw the Lebanese push the Israeli regime out of the bits and pieces of southern Lebanon they had occupied. After the Israeli regime requested a ceasefire in Lebanon, and after that ceasefire was implemented, the Israeli regime began to advance inside Lebanon. In other words, they used the ceasefire to take new territory. And the Lebanese men and women without weapons went to the south and expelled them. And 20 some people were slaughtered. And there are a number of iconic photos where we saw a woman standing in front of a tank and another woman being shot at by Israeli soldiers, but standing firm and refusing to uh, concede. These people forced the Israeli regime out of almost all of the territory that they had occupied. So these are major victories, but I'm not confident that the fighting has ended. The war in Gaza could begin. The war with Lebanon can begin again. And ultimately, I do think we will have war. And I do think that there will be military conflict between Iran and the Israeli regime. The Iranians have said that they will carry out a retaliatory strike against the Israeli regime, which was delayed for two reasons that I know of. One was the collapse of Syria, which forced the Iranians to rethink their air defenses because Syria was now open to the Israelis. And the second was the ceasefire negotiations that began in a serious manner after Trump won the election. The Iranians did not want to hurt the chances of a ceasefire in Gaza, so they held their fire. But I do think that ultimately the chances for violence or continued genocide in Gaza are not low, sadly. I think the potential for violence and for Israeli aggression in Lebanon is not low. And I think there also, if that happens, and I think that the chances are very high that the Iranians will ultimately carry out their retaliation against the Israeli regime sooner rather than later.
Many people have
Hopefully,
commented,
I'm wrong.
hopefully, many people have commented that Israel wants the United States to go to war with Iran. Is that something that you see as likely?
Yes, I think they're absolutely correct. And I should apologize. I do see some questions come up on the screen, but they disappear very quickly. And since I'm talking, it's very difficult for me to read them. So you'll have to do that for me. But yes, without a doubt, the Israelis want a war between Iran and the United States. They've wanted that war for many years now. I think now they're even more desperate than ever before. However, a very it's going to be very difficult for the United States to take that decision. If the United States wants to if it wants to engage in war with Iran, I think it will have to bring in 1 million soldiers from across the world. And I don't think that's doable. I don't think the United States has that sort of money. And with the rise of China and Russia, I don't think that's possible. Also, the United States would, if they strike Iran, Iran will strike back very hard. And those countries in the Persian Gulf region, which host US bases, they will be seen as complicit, and they are all major oil and gas producers. That would destroy the energy market. That would, that would, these regimes would collapse, and I think the price of oil and gas across the world would go through the roof, and it would destroy the global economy. So it would be a war where everyone loses, and I think the United States recognizes that. There is a sort of balance of terror in place, as they used to call it during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Uh, in this case, it's not, of course, nuclear weapons, but it is it is a sort of balance. So I find it hard to believe. I don't believe it's impossible, but I find it difficult to believe that the United States will actually do something that will bring about such a catastrophic situation. Yet again, I don't know.
You mentioned earlier how President Obama was violating the JCPOA, the so-called Iran nuclear deal, and we all know how President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. There's questions in the chat about do you have any thoughts or any comments about any ongoing or future potential negotiations between Iran and the US? And also, I wonder how can Iran trust the US after the United States behaved so dishonestly?
Iran can't trust the United States at all. And I would add to what Obama did with regards to Iran, imposing maximum pressure sanctions that were targeting ordinary people and violating the nuclear deal that he later signed. I would add to that the destruction of Libya, the genocide in Yemen, because that began during his period in the White House, and it was with his green light that the Saudis and the Emiratis and Qatar back then, Al Jazeera and Qatar were fully supporting the genocide in Gaza. So and of course we saw the dirty war in Syria initiated by Obama, and Operation Timber Sycamore was something that he signed onto. So different administrations in the United States have basically destroyed our region, and therefore Iran will never be able to trust the United States. And in the past, whenever we have negotiated with the United States betrayed us. They every time we held out our hand, the United States slapped that hand, to say the least. And during the nuclear deal, Iran uh, lived up to its obligations, and Obama violated the deal. And then Trump, of course, tore up the deal. Before that, we had in the 1990s, the Iranians agreed to give Conoco, an oil company, an oil field in the Persian Gulf. The then president of Iran, Hashemi Rafsanjani, said that this was a green light in an interview. He said that this was a green light for the United States. And after 2 years of negotiations, as the deal was about to be signed, Congress passed a law sanctioning Iranian oil and gas. And the United States government supported that. Later, the United States also, during the Reagan period, had a number of hostages in Lebanon. This was before Hezbollah was created. The United States and Reagan asked Iran to help free those hostages. The Iranians went to Lebanon, used their influence, paid money to different people, and got these people released. But in return, the United States again antagonized Iran. The United States downed an Iranian airliner, killing 290 people. It never apologized. The United States, in fact, lied about the circumstances until it came out years later in a Newsweek article. Of course, the Iranians had given that material, had given the evidence back at the time of the downing of the airliner, but Western media wasn't interested. Just like it is never interested when it's not, today, when it's not in the interests of the governments in the West. We're now hearing, for example, during hearings in the United States, that the United States has been carrying out Operation Timber Sycamore in Syria. This should have been discussed 13 years ago, but only now that Al Qaeda is in Syria, we are hearing this being discussed in government circles, and still the media is not showing interest because the deep state of the United States has been supporting that policy. But in any case, whenever the Iranians tried to cooperate with the United States, tried to diffuse tensions, the United States mistakenly saw that as a sign of Iranian weakness. And that makes negotiating with the United States even more difficult. Because if the United States tries to negotiate with Iran, and for whatever reason Iran agrees to negotiations, instead of using this as an opportunity to resolve some of the issues that exist between the two sides, many in the United States will once again interpret this as a sign of weakness. So it's very difficult to work with Americans, especially since after they negotiate deals, they violate them. The Russians also have experience with that. The Minsk Accords. Uh, the West never intended to implement the Minsk Accords over Ukraine. We later saw the former Chancellor of Germany say that the intention was never to implement the Minsk Accords, it was to buy time. Merkel said that just I think a year and a half ago. Then Hollande, the president of France, he repeated the same thing in a different interview. And of course, the former president of Ukraine said this as well. So the Western powers, Western governments, they expect other countries to abide by international law, but they see themselves as above international law. They see themselves as uh, having exceptional rights. So if they sign an agreement, the other side must abide by its obligations, but since they have special privileges, they can violate them whenever they want. And that makes doing a deal extremely difficult, if not impossible.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. So Professor Marandi, you were speaking about this a little bit earlier, but I want to ask about it again because in the U.S. media, the events of the last 15 or so months, they'll frame it in such a way where they'll basically try to say that the events of the last 15 or so months, they show Israel's strength and the weakness of the Palestinians and Iran, etc. However, you've argued something different. You've argued that the events of the last 15 months have actually demonstrated Israel's weakness and Israel's vulnerability. Could you explain that to our audience members, why you say that?
I'll take this even much further and say that this has been a catastrophe for the collective West. Israel has destroyed the West in the eyes of the rest of the world because the West has been supporting the Holocaust. This is not just Netanyahu's Holocaust, it is the Holocaust of the collective West. And so, across the global South and the global majority, no one is ever going to view the United States or European governments as supporters of freedom and human rights and human dignity. That is gone. The soft power of the United States and its allies has been demolished. And Israel did that. Israel is a burden to the West. And the West is paying a huge price because of the Israeli regime. But yes, as I said earlier, the last 16 months has been a catastrophe for the Israelis and a win for the resistance and the axis of resistance. Some may say, well, Hezbollah has suffered casualties, Hamas has suffered major losses. That's all true. That's what happens in war. That's what happens in conflict. But at the end of the day, Israel said it will destroy Hezbollah. It will take southern Lebanon. It failed. It said it will destroy Hamas. It will destroy Islamic Jihad. It will destroy the resistance. And we saw over the last few days Hamas and the resistance parading in Gaza. The narrative of the Israeli regime about its prisoners in Gaza, its hostages in Gaza, has collapsed. We see thousands of Palestinians who are gradually being freed from Israeli dungeons, many of them in very bad shape. But we see that the Israeli prisoners who were military, the women were all soldiers, we see them very healthy, even though they were in Gaza, even though they were being bombed day and night, even though the people of Gaza were being starved. So the narrative of the West, of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Fox News, Sky News, the BBC, and so on and so forth, has all been demolished. And remember, the Western media does not have the influence that it had before across the rest of the world. The rest of the world has already condemned the Israeli regime. The regime is despised across the world, except for maybe in India or among part of the Indian population. It is despised. That, I think, is the greatest catastrophe, not only for the regime, but for those who supported the regime. So in future, the West can no longer speak about human rights in China or in Russia or even North Korea. What can they say after what they've done to Gaza? So militarily, the regime did not succeed. Again, the only exception is in Syria, but I think in the long run, actually, the fall of Syria is going to be worse for Israel, the allies of the United States, than for Iran. I think time will tell. Syria is a mess, and it's not Iran's burden anymore. And I think ultimately people will come to power in Syria, which will not make the Israeli regime happy, nor Mr. Erdogan. But we'll have to see. I cannot say anything for certain about Syria, but what I can say is that Syria is not going well for those people who supported Al Qaeda.
Thank you, Professor. We're coming close to our time here, so I want to share a very quick reading, and then, Professor, I'll give you the last word to our audience. Over the last 15 or so months, I've heard many comments from people saying that they're astonished, surprised, inspired by how the Palestinians in Gaza can remain so steadfast in the face of such brutal carnage, in the face of such inhumanity. So I'd like to share a very short reading from the Quran so that hopefully people can better understand how Muslims think and how someone like Yahya Sinwar thought. So I'm going to share a very quick reading from the Quran. This is from chapter 2, starting at verse 153. In the Quran, it says, again, chapter 2, verse 153, in English. You who believe, seek help through steadfastness and prayer, for God is with the steadfast. Do not say that those who are killed in God's cause are dead. They are alive, though you do not realize it. We shall certainly test you with fear and hunger and loss of property, wives, and crops. But prophet, give good news to those who are steadfast, those who say, when afflicted with the calamity, we belong to God, and to him we shall return. These will be given blessings and mercy from their Lord, and it is they who are rightly guided. Again, that's from the Quran, and I wanted to share that because maybe it'll help people better understand somebody like Yahya Sinwar and Muslims in general. Professor Marandi, thank you again so much for speaking with us today and giving us a very valuable and important perspective. We're very grateful. If people listening right now want to follow more of your work, where can they find you? And are there any last words you'd like to leave us with?
Just a couple of things. One is that in addition to the heroism of the people of Gaza and Palestine in general, because the West Bank too is suffering enormously as we speak, but also I think it is extraordinary how the people of Lebanon have sacrificed as well as the people in Yemen. Palestine is struggling for its own survival, but the people of Palestine, or they have friends in Lebanon who voluntarily sacrificed themselves, who willingly sacrificed themselves to ease the pressure on Gaza. What Hezbollah did in Lebanon, the sacrifices that Hezbollah made could have all been avoided. And they drew away half of the Israeli army. And during the height of the war between Hezbollah and Israel, most of the Israeli forces were focused on Lebanon and slaughtering the Lebanese. So they made these sacrifices voluntarily, and I think that is extraordinary. And the same is true with Yemen. After 7 years of genocide and isolation, the people of Yemen shut the Red Sea in order to implement the Genocide Convention. And the Americans bombed them, the British bombed them, the Israelis bombed them, and the Saudis and others continued to strangle them, but they were steadfast. And I think this shows the humanity of these people and the sacrifices that they made, the martyrdom of Seyed Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, among others, are all because they wanted to help spare the children of Gaza. In addition to that, I think another important point is that today we see Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the West standing up to genocide, standing against genocide. Young Jews being among the most active in the United States. We saw how, for example, Max Blumenthal put the former U.S. Secretary of State to shame, and so did Sam Hosseini, a Christian. So this is, I think, something that is inclusive to all of us, and all of us in our common humanity are standing against this genocide. And I think this is very important and something that we should not just preserve, but that we should strengthen. I've been banned from Facebook years ago and Instagram, so the only place that I have left is Twitter. So I have a Twitter account. If anyone wants to follow me, that's where I am.
Thank you again, Professor, and thank you everyone so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day or rest of your night, wherever, depending on where you're watching from. Thank you, everyone.